Australian citizens of a responsible mind have noticed with growing alarm a tendency in media to propagate a set of cultural ideas which are entirely and literally foreign to Australian sentiment and British Australian traditions. The quality of mental culture is a matter of concern for all who look to the future of Australia as a civilised nation. This modest little publication from 1935, held here in the stacks at the State Library of New South Wales, has lots of such strong opinions to express on what's right and, more importantly, what's wrong for Australian culture.
Now you're going to hear the first performance of the new BBC Dance Orchestra, directed by Henry Hall. It's just the time for...
Back then, Australia looked to Britain for moral and cultural guidance. Meanwhile, thousands of American pulp magazines were being dumped on the Australian market, bringing with them American values and threatening the production of local content. A Cultural Defence Committee was formed, and it lobbied the government to do something about it. These pulp publications were sensational. Alien invasions, tawdry romances, cowboys and Indians, stories of true crime, all of it cheaply produced, imported and made widely available. It was a corrupting force on Australian youth and working class readers, from which they needed protection. The Cultural Defence Committee did have some success in restricting the flow of US content, but their efforts proved redundant anyway. With the outbreak of World War II, all foreign imports were drastically restricted overnight. But a return to the morality the Defence Committee had hoped for was not to be. For while import restrictions kept foreign material at bay, Australia was now in a great position to develop quick and dirty pulp all of its own. By the time the war came to a close and restrictions on manpower, paper and printing ink were lifting, publishing houses across Sydney were poised to fill the gap in the market for cheap, disposable printed culture. Pretty much akin to the celebrity and throwaway magazines of today. Back then was crime stories, adventure stories, spy stories, romance stories and the like. With the dawn of the age of pulps in Australia, about a dozen or so Sydney publishers moved into that racket. Among them was Frank Johnson, occupying an office here at 350 George Street. It's the content and records born at this location that were acquired by the State Library. Very, very imposing building. Frank had an office out the back, not so imposing. He'd been there for years publishing literary journals, small-run fiction, but in the 40s he turned to pulp. We don't really know why, but he was pretty good at it.
The industry was huge. At one stage, the presses must have been running day and night. Anyone who could write was press ganged into, there's a gap in the market, we need entertaining material, and literally, you're a pen for hire. In the working class, writer is not, and still today, is not a profession. It's never known to sustain many people. So you've got these people who are doing a little bit of writing on the side, usually to pay, strangely enough, for a deposit on a house. And all of them, interestingly, went into the publishers. They were workers. So on the way home, they would go to the same 3 or 4 places, see what each needed, sometimes put them up against each other, but they were not authors. They were a name, but not often their own name. They were just someone who could fill in the blanks.
Among the trove of Johnson records preserved here at the library, there's original cover artwork, manuscripts, mock-ups, published works, but it's the letters between Frank and his freelancers that are particularly revealing, painting a not altogether pretty picture of how this one publisher operated in a tough marketplace. There's masses of material here from writers to Frank Johnson, from freelancers and from absolute amateurs, all of it pitching stories to Frank. Quite a few acceptances too, including to people who'd probably never had anything published before in their life. There's also a great many angry letters to Frank Johnson from unhappy writers who have been stiffed, they say, for their money. There's one here from Frank's old friend, a journalist, Charlie Thompson in Newcastle. After years and years of writing for Frank, he says, "Dear Frank, I was astounded today when I received your paltry contribution of £8. I thought my eyesight had failed me. I'm hanged if I can understand why you want to force me into suing you. Another series of letters here from Frank's old friend and associate Will Lawson, who'd published many successful titles with Frank. He's sick of having to come to Frank, he says, hat in hand for money which is due to me. And also, when you said on Saturday when I mentioned money, oh, I knew that was coming next, well, you can go to hell. Time and time again, we see this in the Frank Johnson correspondence. A writer pushed a breaking point, and then the next letter they send is a little bit conciliatory. Dear Frank, sorry I went snarky. And we can glean from this, I think, that Frank was a master at giving people just the right quota of crumbs when they're at absolute breaking point. And that way he seems to have kept quite a large number of freelancers in permanent penury, but on the string for years and years on end. When punters picked up a pulp, they were, for all intents and purposes, buying the labour of the writers. Simple story they could read on the train on the way home from work, say. But it wasn't the quality of writing or originality of the stories that inspired readers to open their wallets. Rather, it was the work of the artists, the bold, sensational covers in a kind of Darwinian competition for attention on newsstands that were really responsible for shifting these publications in such huge numbers.
Well, let's have a look at this one. I love this one. Now, it looks to me like a Southern belle dress. She looks like she's just effed off the Mississippi gambling saloon. But what's the title?
Old Man Murray.
Old Man Murray. So we've got this kind of weird collapsing of what? American and Australian?
Old Man River becomes the Murray River. That's something that we do find a bit in the Johnson stuff, is that it's an Australian setting, but it's sexed up in either a European or US kind of way, with a kind of romanticism that maybe didn't really characterise Australian life in 47.
But see how her body is prominently displayed. Penny to a pound, but she's hardly in the text at all. Penny to a pound, she's only got a small role.
Okay, yeah.
The body shapes are obviously very different than today. Voluptuous obviously is better, but you can tell the evening gown woman is the woman who's out and about in any of the covers. She's trouble. We know that. She's got a shiny dress on, she's trouble. Jewellery, red, shiny, trouble. If she's got a twin set and pearls and modest hair, brown hair, not blonde or red, they're trouble. And if she's prone or has been knocked over or is in some way needing help, that's your heroine. Again, doesn't match the story. I'm just going purely on the cover art. A book that you're going to write within 10 days is going to be of limited sophistication, but then that's what the reader wants. The romances are bland, all of them. They're bland because they have to appeal to the widest possible population. So in an effort to do that, you have goodies and baddies. We haven't looked at the comics.
Yeah, okay, the comics are pretty amazing. These are quite early, these are wartime comics.
Wow.
Yeah. As a kid who loved comics, I think it's these publications that make up a really special part of the Johnson collection. The artists were given a huge amount of creative freedom, coming up with ideas for characters, drawing and writing the pages. One of the freelance artists who came to work for Johnson was Peter Chapman. He made his start as a teenager, fresh out of East Sydney Technical College. He now lives in Narrabri in country New South Wales. That looks pretty early in your career to me.
God, it was bloody awful. He used to pay us 30 bob a page to start with, which was not a great deal of money even then. But because I was fast, I used to earn about £10 a week, which was a fortune then.
Diana Hastings, is that one of yours? Did you invent that character too? She's a good looking lass.
I don't know what the hell the stories are about. But you looked at everything to get ideas. Because ideas are the hardest thing to come up with. Like a lot of comics earlier, when he's crossing the bushes like that, and they right under there he's crossing the bushes. Like, that's ridiculous. You don't tell the story twice. It doesn't matter how well it's drawn. You don't have to do it twice. I used to drop in and see if they had any work for you. And you might go in there and You got known to the art directors, but they never ring you. You had to chase it. And he said, oh, wait a minute, come back tomorrow, I might have a job for you. It's just like that in the hallway all the time. And that's how we worked. Not just with Frank, with all of the publishers.
This turned up in the collection there as well, some covers, a lot of racing stories, and this one has your name on it.
I think that was the first of those.
Was it? Yeah.
Yeah, that series. No one else had them out.
The racing yarns are really interesting because Australian, I mean, it's been often said, is a nation of wowsers. We actually had books about racing. That would have never gotten through America. You don't get many books on cricket or on football because they're team sports and you need a hero. But horse racing, they're usually thinly disguised either romances or detective-ish, shall we say crime fiction.
Crime titles were hugely successful for Johnson, in particular the famous detective series, which presented stories of Australian crime dating right back to the colonial era.
I think the idea that modern Australia began as a repository for criminals, everybody knew a crook, and it was a bit like just working out what your neighbours were up to. So we constructed society through our crime fiction, and the true crime tales were particularly important in allowing us to see urban areas or more rural areas, and the idea that they were reading about something that had really happened, they could allow themselves to be very much caught up with the details of the case, and so they feel that they very much are experiencing a crime in Sydney or a crime out in the bush.
A very pretty, picturesque part of Sydney, Rachel, but it has its very dark history.
It certainly does. It's the site of an extremely violent crime, the Mary Jane Hicks gang rape case, which was conveniently called by the Victorians of the time as the Mount Rennie outrage.
In some awful way, this is the story that keeps giving, isn't it? There's the terrible crime at the start, then there's a trial, and then there's the terrible outcome of the trial, and a whole number of public controversies surrounding different aspects of it.
Absolutely. So 20 men were originally charged, and while some of the sentences were commuted, 4 young men did hang for the crime. So people who were already debating the pros and cons of capital punishment, those debates became even louder after the hanging. Like so many hangings of the day, they were botched. So it was a particularly horrific way to die. But on the other side, there was also the argument that Mary Jane Hicks had endured a particularly horrific crime. The very business model of pulp was a vast amount of material produced quickly. So the Mary Jane Hicks case, for example, heavily documented in the press of the day. All that material was available to quickly repackage.
That's exactly what they did. It was about maybe earning 10 bob or a quid for a story you could write and sell to Frank Johnson. You know, you weren't going to give it 6 months of your life or 3 weeks of your life. You know, you're going to write it on the weekend. So once Johnson realises he's onto a good thing with true crime, there's plenty of material there for him to exploit. But eventually they run out of stories. So Charlie Thompson's complaining by 1954, one of Frank's writers, that they've done one story 3 times for God's sake, and it's time to switch to overseas stories. They don't do that, and the magazine folds. But a new generation comes of age in the 60s and others in the 70s, 80s and so on. So a lot of that Frank Johnson material is the fodder of new waves, new appropriations of the same old canon of crime stories. The decline of the pulp industry came fairly quickly, and it was shortly after Frank Johnson closed his doors in 1960 that he himself passed away. For publishers of that period, most of their materials have long since been lost, but Johnson's ephemera and papers were kept in the family home and were acquired by the library in 1965. For a long time they sat here largely undisturbed, and now, half a century later, they're seeing the light of day, and they're an incredible picture of the way the pulp business was done back then.
Want to know more about the exhibition? Use our free Wi-Fi to download Curio, the mobile app with in-depth commentary, stories, and extras. Pulp Confidential on Curio. Available now from the App Store or Google Play. Curio, there's no cure for curiosity.